For this series of tutorials, we're going to look at the Blender modeling and animation software. It could be said that Blender is a non-modal and a non-blocking software suite. Suppose you've got a window broken down into different areas. In one area you've got the 3D viewport. In another area you've got the shading editor. Now these two editors are non-blocking. In other words, you can work on one and go straight over and work on the other. It's not a problem. Again, let's suppose we've got the 3D viewport editor open along with the shading editor. You can go back and forth between the two without needing to be in any specific mode. Hence, it's non-modal. A Blender window is typically broken down into different areas. The areas, they can be split, resized, and joined. You can increase or decrease the number of areas. There are some default arrangements of areas. We call these workspaces. The workspaces are accessible from the tabs at the top of each Blender window. For example, when I installed Blender 2.92, I had prearranged workspaces for layout, modeling, sculpting, UV editing, texture paint, shading, animation, rendering, compositing, and scripting. Now, you can add your own workspaces to this list. You can also delete any workspaces. There's a wide range of editors that can be used to fill these areas. If you go to the upper left-hand corner of any of the editors that you've got open, you'll see a selector for the editor type. Once you click that, you've got 4 different categories of editors. You've got general, animation, scripting, and data. If you look at the general, you notice the 3D viewport. This is arguably the most used editor in all of Blender. To the right of there, you've got animation to animate the objects in your scene. You've got scripting, which basically means programming. And then you've got data. This gives you access to all sorts of data that you can use. Editors are broken down into regions. One region that all editors have is the header region, which is usually at the top of the editor. However, if you right-click on the header region, you have an option to flip to bottom, which basically means to move the thing to the bottom. Let's take a brief look at some of the editors in Blender. Of course, number 1 is the 3D viewport. This is where we can not only model the objects, but we can also work on animation, texturing, and more. Next, we've got the image editor, where we can view and edit 2D assets, including images and textures. And next we have the UV editor. We use that to map 2D assets, including our images and textures, onto our 3D objects. And we can also edit what are called UVs. You might be wondering why we're using U and V. And the only reason is because X, Y, and Z are already being used. So it's just 2 letters. Other than that, it really doesn't mean too much. In a lot of these 3D software packages, we have what are known as node editors. Blender, being a 3D software package, also has node editors. First one we're going to look at is the shader editor. And this is a node-based editor for creating and modifying both materials and textures. Cycles and Eevee, which are Blender's 2 rendering engines that are widely used, make heavy use of the shader editor for both materials and lighting. Nodes are basically boxes. They've got inputs and they've got outputs. The inputs are on the left side, the outputs are on the right side. And you can basically string these together in all sorts of patterns for both materials and textures. There are some nodes that are only input and some that are only output. Stringing nodes together gives us what we call a node tree. The difference between this tree and some of the others you may have seen in other places is that it's not a vertical tree, it's a horizontal tree. Basically everything is moving from left to right across the various nodes. Similar to the shading editor, we have the compositing editor. we're also using nodes in this editor. We use this to both assemble and enhance images or movies. Using composition nodes, we're able to glue pieces of footage together and possibly colorize or enhance the whole sequence at once. It's a way to basically manage the whole of an animation. In this way, you can use composition nodes to both assemble video clips and to enhance them. The new node editor on the scene is the geometry node editor. And you may have guessed that yes, it does enable you to modify the geometry. Another node editor is the texture nodes editor. And they say this is a legacy system that will soon be replaced with something newer. And with this texture generation system, it enables texture creation by combining colors, patterns, and other textures similar to the shader writing with material nodes. Okay, I already mentioned the Compositor, and there's another way to edit video in Blender. We use the Video Sequence Editor, or VSE. This is also sometimes called the sequencer. And the sequencer within Blender, it's a complete video editing system that allows you to combine multiple video channels and add all sorts of effects to them. You can use these effects to create powerful video edits, especially when you combine it with some of the animation power built into Blender. Next, we have the Movie Clip Editor, which has two main purposes. It can be used for tracking and masking of movies. Motion tracking is used to track the motion of either objects and or the camera, and through the constraints to apply this tracking data to one or more 3D objects. There are many reasons for using masks. They can be used for motion tracking, to mask out or influence a particular object in the footage, and they can also be used in rotoscoping to pull a particular object out of the footage, or as a rough mat for green screen keying. Okay, now we're ready to start looking at some of the animation editors in Blender. First one we're going to look at is the Dope Sheet Editor, and this kind of gives us a big view of all the keyframes inside a scene. Now you've got all sorts of frames within an animation, and certain of those frames are keyframes because they might start or end a particular part of an animation, say a rotation of an object, for example. And this gives us a big view of all the keyframes. In addition to the Dope Sheet Editor, we also have the Timeline Editor. This gives us a broad overview of a scene's animation. It'll show us the current frame, keyframes of the active object, the start and end frames of your animation sequence. The next animation editor we look at is the Graph Editor, and this will allow us to adjust the animation curves over time for any property that is animatable. So just remember that you don't have to only drop the keyframes in place and then let them be as is. You can adjust the curves that are put in place once the keyframes are set. Next, we have the Drivers Editor. This is kind of an advanced editor. It allows us to drive one property using another property. Finally, we have the Nonlinear Animation Editor. It's also known as the NLA editor. This can manipulate and repurpose actions without having to deal with keyframes at all. It's used to make broad, significant changes to a scene's animation with relative ease. Now we'll look at some of the scripting editors in Blender. The first one is probably the text editor, and this is mainly used for writing Python code, Blender Python. You've got syntax highlighting, which is important for programmers, and you also have the ability to run the script from within the editor window. Next, we have the Python console, and I do want to point out that there are two consoles. The one we're talking about here is basically used to run snippets of code. It could be native Python code, or it could be something specific to Blender, either way. But there's another console, which is called the System Console, and that's the one that's used to launch Blender. And it may be visible on some platforms right away, depending on what platform you're using. But if you don't see that, go to Window, toggle System Console, and that'll give you the System Console. If you're running a script in the text editor, that's where you're going to see the errors if they do show up. It's not going to be in the Python console. Anyway, the Python console, it's a quick way to execute commands or test commands, see how they work. And you've got autocomplete, and it's basically your typical Python prompt. And it's a good way to explore the possibilities of what can be done in Blender Python. Next, we have the info editor. Suppose you delete the default cube and insert a Suzanne. Here's where you'll see the Python code for deletion and the creation of the new mesh object. So that's how you use the info editor. Okay, so now we're going to go over some of the data editors. First one we're going to hit on is the outliner. And this is an editor that allows us to organize data in the blend file. It could be scene data, models, objects, and you can view the data in the scene. You can select and deselect the objects using the outliner. You can hide objects, and there's a lot you can do here. It's one of the editors that you will be using quite often. The next editor on the list is the Properties editor, and this is also one that you're going to make heavy use of. Here you've got a series of tabs. You've got one for render, you've got modifiers, you've got one for physics, one for materials, the list goes on. So you're going to be using this quite a bit. And I would like to point out that the tabs in the Properties editor will change depending on what object you have selected, or if you have an object selected. So those do change depending on this or that. Next, you have the File Browser editor, and this is kind of what you might expect from a name like that. It's used for opening, saving blend files. You can also look at other contents of other blend files, and basically any operations that are file related. Another data editor is the Preferences editor, and here there's a lot that you can do. Basically anything that you might expect for a preference is here. You've got interface, themes, viewport, lights, editing, animation, add-ons, which are scripts that give you additional abilities in your Blender environment. You've got input, navigation, key map. That's basically mapping keys to functions. You've got system, save and load, and file paths. So there's quite a bit here. And that's about it for this first in a series of tutorials about Blender. Please like, subscribe, and if you have any suggestions for videos on Blender or other topics, please leave it in the comments below. Thank you very much.